Welcome to Game Design Hour, the podcast where I interview the people behind the video games you love. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Chris Chung about his work on the video game Catlateral Damage. Let's get into the interview. What was the first thing that sparked your interest in video games and creating them?
I had a friend in elementary school, or a couple of friends that had video game consoles before I kind of knew what they were. And, I would hang out with them, play, old Super Nintendo games, Sega Genesis games. And I really got hooked on games just kind of as a medium. But it wasn't until high school where I learned about Game Maker, which is still around. And I started playing around with some tutorials and stuff, and kind of realized that I really liked playing games, and I had an interest in computers and drawing and such that, I could actually make games one day. Yeah, that's kind of how it started.
After that, how did you first get into the video game industry?
So after high school, I went to Worcester Polytechnic Institute and studied interactive media and game development. And after that, my first job in the industry was at a local studio doing quality assurance. So I did that for a little bit, was still kind of making games on the side. And now I basically do a little bit of everything.
What studio did you work at?
First studio I worked at was Demiurge Studios. They're in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And they're also still around, still making stuff.
How did you first think of the idea for Catlateral Damage?
So I always grew up with cats. At one point we had 5 cats at the same time, which is kind of a lot. But there really wasn't a period of my life where there wasn't at least one cat in the house. The first version of Catlateral Damage started out of a game jam, a 1-week game jam called the 7-Day FPS Game Jam. And it's just, make an interesting first-person game. Since I had grown up with cats, my first idea was, what would a first-person game be like if you were to see the world from the eyes of a cat? Just an ordinary cat, nothing, fantastical about it, no guns, nothing like that. And I kind of rolled with that idea. And, the obvious thing is, shrink down the perspective from a standard first person game. And if there weren't guns, well, I guess you have 2 little paws that you could use to slap stuff around. And that was basically the prototype. Was just a small room. You're a small animal and you run around and knock things on the floor.
After that game jam and prototype, what made you decide to go off and make this game beyond the game jam?
After the game jam, I was doing a little bit of work on it, a couple of improvements, bug fixes, just kind of, learning how to develop past the prototype, because I was still working full time at the time, and doing this kind of in my spare time. And a couple months of working on it and posting it to Reddit to get feedback on one of the game development subreddits, it kind of took off without me knowing. I was just sharing, progress updates and GIFs every now and then. But I think one site picked it up because it was a free web demo at the time, and posted some GIFs to like Twitter and Tumblr, and those got a lot of views. And then somebody posted one of the GIFs to Reddit, and it hit the front page of Reddit for a little while, and it just kind of snowballed. A bunch of news outlets picked it up, and I think it was at that point where I had built the prototype in the game basically for me, because I wanted to see a game where you played as a cat, because I thought that'd be funny. But it seemed like a lot of other people would also want to play this as a full game. So getting all that attention on it kind of gave me the motivation to see what it would look like as a full game that had more content, more features. And shortly after kind of all the press, I started talking with the founder at Firehose Games, which is another local studio. They were starting a kind of an indie incubator program. So I started talking with them, and they were like, yeah, let's work together and help you ship this game. And with their help, did a successful Kickstarter, ended up releasing it on Steam and then later PS4, and then added VR support because that was also kind of a fun project. So yeah, it was really just the attention and kind of support that I got that kind of pushed it from prototype to a full game.
Were there any challenges with bringing it from a game on Steam and PS4 to VR?
Yeah, there was a lot of rework, primarily around the player controls and the player viewpoint. It was a little bit more straightforward because it was already a first person game, but the movement had to be completely redone. The paw swatting, we wanted to make one-to-one with, the VR controllers. So that had to be redone. And there were also some levels that didn't make it into the VR version just because they had so many objects in them. They just weren't performant in VR and weren't able to hit kind of that frame rate to make it so that people didn't get motion sick. So yeah, there's a handful of challenges, but I think because the game, like I said, was first person and pretty straightforward, pretty simple mechanically, it wasn't too bad.
Were there any interesting ideas that you had at one point and were possibly going to put into the game, but you just ended up cutting?
Yeah, I feel like the core concept of the game kind of led to a bunch of cool ideas that couldn't make it in for one reason or the other. I know at one point in working with Firehose, we were talking about having like a final boss to the game that would have been like a vacuum that is riding around the house, and you have to kind of knock stuff into it to disable it or to beat it. I know there was like a more stealth mode that I was thinking of early on, where you tried to kind of not knock a bunch of stuff over without waking your owner, but that ended up being a bit too complex. Yeah, I feel like there are a handful of other small things, but those are kind of the big ones that I remember.
What was your process for creating each of the levels?
For the original Catlateral, my original plan was to hand build all the levels just from several wall pieces and the selection of furniture and other objects. But throughout development, we realized that it would probably be more effective, since I was basically the only programmer on the game, to build the levels procedurally. So we would have a set of pieces, a set of furniture, and then basically design and write a system to procedurally generate each of the levels. And that's what we ended up going with. So all the levels in the game are completely procedurally generated. It was actually a pretty interesting challenge. I think it took me about 2 months to actually build that system, but the outcome I think is pretty nice. And I think a lot of players don't realize that the levels are procedurally generated, which I think is nice in some regard, because it makes it seem like that they were hand built. I know there are some rough edges to the system, but I think the system as a whole works pretty well to kind of make rooms that seem to have obvious purposes, like a bedroom or a bathroom or a kitchen, and doesn't make anything that's looks super broken or super weird.
Managing scope is a really important part of game design. How did you work to manage the scope of Catlateral Damage while working on it?
Yeah, that was a big component, again, because I was kind of the only programmer and the lead developer. Yeah, a lot of it was just thinking of kind of what the timeline was, and what was kind of our shortest path to release, because I think my original estimate was obviously low. I think I initially estimated that we would have the game out in about a year, or I think it might have been a little bit less than that, from when our Kickstarter completed to when I thought it was going to launch. But it ended up taking several months past that. But a lot of it was just determining frequently, every week, every couple of weeks, kind of what's the state of the game, what are the big things that are missing, and really thinking of it from kind of a player perspective of like, what are the things that the players are going to notice is missing, or what are they asking for? What are the higher priority things we should be getting in? And then also thinking, like, going back to the vacuum boss, like thinking, this is actually a big task with a lot of components, and taking that into consideration when kind of deciding what to cut and what to prioritize.
How large was the team that worked on Catlateral Damage?
It was mostly me on the code side. We worked with an artist to help with two artists to help with a lot of the 3D models and some of the other, some of the animation components. There was Eitan Gleinert, who's a studio head at Firehose. He helped with a lot of the kind of business marketing. We worked with someone to do all the music for the game as well. And then I'm sure there are a handful of other contributors that were more part-time, but I think that was the people that had the biggest contributions to it.
Fixing bugs is another huge part of developing video games. Were there any strange or interesting bugs that you came across while working on Catlateral Damage?
Yeah, there are, being kind of a physics-heavy game, there were definitely a lot of kind of silly things that happened. And also, since it was my first release as an indie developer, I was still kind of learning the tools and learning how to develop the game as I was building it. So there were definitely a lot of kind of strange things that popped up there. I know one of the big challenges that had a lot of funny bugs was there's a museum level, and kind of the big centerpiece in the museum level is this giant T-Rex fossil skeleton that you can walk up and knock down, and all the little bones kind of tumble to the ground. And getting that set up was a challenge, and there were definitely some instances where it would kind of wobble funny, or just the way that the physics were set up, it would just like explode and pieces would go everywhere. And I think the bug is still somewhere in the game. There's like a small chance that depending on how it spawns, sometimes it just falls down by itself. Yeah, and that was just with that one kind of piece of the level. But yeah, I know there was another one where there's a 3D model for a cat that shows up on the main menu, and also at the start of every level. And at one point, I forget what the cause was, but the animations were importing incorrectly. So the cat model was completely garbled. And I just remember, I think its eyeballs were like mapped to the ear bones on the rig. So then it was just this distorted cat model with this like one eyeball like twitching, and it was really disturbing, but also hilarious at the same time.
Do you think that Kickstarter is a good way of obtaining funding for indie devs, or is there a different way that you think might work better?
I think back when we did the Kickstarter for Catlateral Damage, I think we were kind of at the tail end of kind of the gold rush for video games. I feel like the kind of months and years prior to that, a lot of people were getting a lot of money from Kickstarter and funding their games that way. I think nowadays, and it was true kind of during and after the Catlateral Kickstarter, was that I think you can still find success there, but it's not as easy as it used to be. And I know a lot of games, they basically put their game up on Kickstarter when it's near the tail end of development, so they get enough funds to kind of round out development, as opposed to getting all the funds up front to fund the entire development. So yeah, I think it's still possible to get funding for indie devs, but running a Kickstarter is a lot of work. I think we spent like a whole month or two just focus on running the Kickstarter, and I think the money that you get from it, it's highly unlikely that it'll cover your entire development. So it's possible. There are pluses and minuses to it.
Are there ways besides Kickstarters that you would recommend for game devs to obtain funding?
Yeah, I think, and this is something I think that's changed since we did the Kickstarter for Catlateral, was that I think if you were to ask me back in 2016, 2015, I would be pretty wary of working with publishers. There weren't too many, and I think they were kind of bigger. And I think, like the terms for indie developers weren't as good. But nowadays it seems like there are a lot more that have popped up. And a lot of the terms have become more developer friendly. So I think, yeah, nowadays I would definitely consider and recommend looking at publisher funding, because I think working with a publisher, that relationship I think has improved over the years. And I think it's just that space has matured a lot. That I think it's definitely a viable option to fund indie games.
For people who might not know what a publisher does, what does a publisher do?
So it varies depending on the publisher, and a lot of stuff can be negotiated too. But I think the big things are you're basically looking for a partner to help manage, some relationships or some aspects of development that you might not have the knowledge to, or the resources to handle on your own. So like a lot of publishers will help you kind of push your games to other platforms. Like if you're only doing a PC or a Steam launch, they'll help you do, console ports. Another big thing is like just marketing. For small developers, it's hard to, both make an entire game and tell the world about it at the same time. And publishers, since they have a lot more visibility on them and a lot more experience, they're basically a louder voice, and they can get a lot more eyes on your game. And there's a bunch of other small things that various publishers can handle too, like localization into other languages, or QA testing resources and things like that. So and that's in addition to funding as well. So yeah, they're really, and I think, years ago it was more of a, you're selling your soul to a publisher and they basically own the game, and, you get, a trickle of revenue from it. But yeah, like I said, I think the relationship is definitely more developer friendly now. So you're basically looking for a partner to help you basically develop and ship your game.
How did you do playtesting for Catlateral Damage, and what experiences from this project will you take on to your next one?
A lot of the playtesting we did was like local community events. So I'm located in Boston, and we have a pretty good game development community. So, and there's a bunch of meetups, or at least they were pre-pandemic, in-person meetups on various game dev topics. And one of the big ones was kind of these demo nights that they would put on, where, you'd bring an in-progress build of your game and people would walk around, play your game, give you feedback. And, there would be, multiple games at these events to check out. So we did that a lot for Catlateral, to basically just make sure things were good, things were understood, frequently found bugs from playtesting. So that was definitely a big one throughout development. And then as part of our Kickstarter, we did do a kind of closed beta tier. So we ended up getting a lot of feedback from actual players as well through that. And that was super, super helpful. Yeah, the big takeaway is just that playtesting is super helpful. and I feel like every time I do a playtesting session, I see something new or learn something new about whatever game we're testing. And it's just because there's as a developer, you kind of know basically everything about the game, and you're kind of always in the woods, looking at all the details of the game. And a lot of people don't have that perspective. So getting fresh eyes on it is really helpful to see things that you would totally miss because you're working on a specific feature, or you've seen this menu 800 times. So yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest thing, is that you basically should always play test. Don't ever and do it as soon as possible. That's also a valuable thing that I learned.
How did you work to balance the skill tree in Catlateral Damage so that the player doesn't get too overpowered too early on, but the player still feels like they are progressing and their character is getting more powerful?
In the original Catlateral, the kind of skill upgrades you got were randomized along with the procedurally generated levels. I think they were pretty much just purely random. I don't know that there was really any hard balance to it, but I think the kind of range of your abilities was so large that it was basically impossible to kind of max out a stat early on in an earlier level. So it was really kind of later levels that you would get maxed out stats. So, and that was one of the things that I changed for the remastered version, was that I wanted to add more kind of player agency to that and make it a little more interesting. So, and a couple of ways I did that was each playable cat has kind of base stats now that are different to kind of make the choice of which cat you play as a little more interesting. And then there's a complete skill tree with stat boosts and special abilities that you can choose to unlock with the in-game like treats currency that you find in levels. So it's less about finding random upgrades and more about collecting these treats to spend towards the type of stats that you want to improve over time, or the abilities that you want to have. Which
parts of the game did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
So the procedural level system was definitely one of them. I know that took a bunch of time and had a lot of kind of fine tuning and polishing and bug fixing on it. I think the player controls was another one, which I think just throughout development got minor iterations and improvements on, and bug fixes too. I know there was a weird physics bug where if you jumped next to a wall or a piece of furniture, you would jump higher, which was like you would basically launch yourself up. So there were constantly kind of improvements done to that. Yeah, I think those are kind of the main components that kind of took the most time to get right.
Are there any fun little details that you added to the game that you think most players might miss?
So in the original Catlateral, we did a handful of kind of crossover cameos with some other indie games. That got added as an update post-launch, and I know there's about a dozen or so of them. A lot of them were like local Boston studios, like the developer of Soda Drinker Pro is a friend of mine, and so we put a bonus soda in the game that makes a sound effect from Soda Drinker Pro in the game. And then there's like a cameo from the Goat Simulator Goat and Octodad. So a bunch of fun stuff like that. But those are objects that are a bit rare to find in levels. So if you've only played the game for a little while, you might have missed those. But yeah, I think those are kind of they're kind of like Easter eggs, but they're a fun kind of secret in the game that I think a lot of people don't see.
Did you have any interesting level ideas that ended up getting cut or just never made it into any version of the game?
Yeah, I think at one point I was thinking of, a very like complicated, narrative or something that to kind of thread through the game, because there's, standard, more generic house type levels. And then there's these bonus levels like the museum or the kind of Halloween themed secret lab. In the original game, there's a randomized events, and one of them is moon gravity, where gravity just becomes moon gravity for a minute or two, and you kind of are floating through levels. It helps you get up to higher places easier. And once I put that in, I was thinking, what if there was actually a space level, like you were in a space station or something, where basically moon gravity is just on constantly. And I was trying to justify how the cat would get into space. And I think going down that thread, there was also another funny idea for like an ancient Egypt level, where I thought it would be funny that, in ancient Egypt, cats were worshipped. And I thought it would be really, really hilarious if this cat somehow went back in time to ancient Egypt and just was knocking over all these old things like, mummification jars and all this stuff. And, the ancient Egyptians would be like, oh, that's adorable. Or, this god is angry, or whatever they would think. But yeah, those ended up not making it in for just honestly the amount of development time that we had, and how much more it would take to get those in.
Are you able to tell me a bit about the decision to have the point system change partway through the game and change from items toppled to the cost of the damage that the player has dealt?
Yeah, so that was an attempt to kind of switch things up a bit, so that instead of objects, most objects counting for 1 point, or some bigger objects counting for more, you could have objects that were the same number of points have different monetary values, so that you would prioritize different objects. So things like the TV are more expensive, so you would probably go for that first in those levels that counted money. And also it was kind of a thematic idea too. Like it seemed like in the museum, for example, it would make sense that you might be counting how much money damage you would be doing, as opposed to points like in a regular level. So yeah, it was just kind of trying to twist how a player might perceive different levels by kind of changing their goals slightly.
What was the biggest design challenge you faced while working on Catlateral Damage?
I think the biggest design challenge that I honestly don't think we solved for the original Catlateral was basically the longevity or the replayability of it. The procedural generation system was an attempt at trying to get a little bit more replayability in the game, but I think at the end of the day, it didn't do as much as we had hoped. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to kind of revisit the game for Remeowstered, was to see if there was a way to basically take, because there's a lot of content in the game in terms of, things you can knock over and the different level types. And I think for the original game, a lot of people didn't see a lot of the content just because of how it was presented. So kind of switching over to Remeowstered was one of the big challenges that I wanted to try to solve was that kind of replayability issue. And I think I did a decent job, or at least switched it up a bit to kind of extend the game with basically the same amount of content. But I think with any game that tends to be a challenge is kind of what goals can you give players to make them want to keep playing over and over again or experiencing the same content over and over again. Because, one option is just throw a lot of content in the game, right? And there's a lot more to see, but there's definitely a lot of mechanical systems and progression that can help extend replayability a bit.
Looking back now, what do you wish you could have done differently before the launch of the game?
Honestly, I don't know that there's too much that I would have changed for the original game. I think we did a decent job reaching out to press and influencers at the time to get a lot of eyes on the game, and the game launched pretty well given kind of the size of the project and the size of the team. Yeah, I feel like it's weird to say because I remember the launch being pretty smooth. I was expecting some major fire to happen or some major issues to pop up, and other than like one simple bug that I managed to fix pretty quickly, everything went pretty smoothly. So yeah, I don't know that there's really anything big that I would have changed looking back on it.
What was the biggest lesson that you learned from working on Catlateral Damage?
I think definitely kind of thinking about scope constantly was something that I was doing, and I think that was definitely a good mindset to have throughout development. So that's definitely something that I've kind of carried forward to future projects. I think just learning the development processes and kind of how when we should be thinking about what throughout development. There was a lot of things with the original Catlateral where it felt like we were designing stuff kind of late into development and kind of trying to add new things, very close to when we wanted to launch. So definitely kind of taking that into for new projects, thinking, what things can we try to evaluate as soon as possible? What decisions can we, core decisions can we make early so that we're not, kind of building things and adding new features, adding new risks, adding new bugs, too late. It is definitely something that I think it's kind of another thing that I'm constantly thinking for future projects is, trying to figure out all the risky stuff during the prototyping phase, making some decisions of, this is what the game is, and then, working through production to actually build that stuff and mitigate, issues and other bugs so that, you don't have things popping up, as you're trying to launch the game or whatnot.
What would be your biggest piece of advice for newer game devs?
I mean, it sounds silly, but I would say make a lot of games. And I wouldn't say, make big games. I would definitely say make a lot of small games because that was one thing that I did that I think helped with Catlateral was I was always doing a lot of small game jams. And I think just being able to take a game idea from, this vague concept and prototyping it and then actually shipping it, even if it's just, putting it up on itch or putting it up as a web demo, you learn a lot just going through that cycle of just building an idea and putting it in front of other people. And I think the more times you do that, the better you get at doing it. So it's basically a muscle that you're training. Is basically how to build and ship games. And I think that's just a good skill to have for any size game. If you continue to make small games, if you end up working on a AAA game, I think just knowing how to go through development is a super helpful skill to have.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
I'm working full-time at Firehose Games now, and I'm currently on kind of in the initial stages of building a new game. So basically the kind of ideation, kind of R&D phase of coming up with a new game idea and doing a lot of prototyping and trying to figure out which, what are the big risks with a bunch of different ideas, with the outcome of basically having a concept that feels solid enough that Firehose can build it as their next game. So a lot of stuff I can't talk about, but that's basically what I'm doing is going through a bunch of ideas, doing a lot of prototyping and trying to evaluate them for, how they would be built potentially into a commercial product.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, this is fun.
And that's how the interview went down. I want to thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing or following. It is different on every platform. If you like the show, make sure to share it with a friend or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.